Good to be here, lovely location and great conference, and I think it's a really interesting time. I wish I sort of heard some of the other talks in this conference, because so much is going on within this particular part of the industry, isn't it? And I wanted to talk about this issue today, about the increased sort of use of, let's just call them, I call them machines, perhaps, because I'm don't want to get unstuck on some of the in a room of people who are technology experts. I don't want to sort of get hung up on the on the nomenclature, but I think that sometimes the conversation around this space is it can be driven a little bit by commercial incentives, clearly, and many of us are in commercial organisations, and that's a consideration. But also, some of the conversation can be quite technical as well, and legitimately so. We have to have those technical conversations. You have to have the commercial considerations. But I think what I wanted to do with this, and because I've been looking at this sort of area and just thinking about it, and just thinking, okay, what do we in terms of the whole area of synthetic in respondents and in chatbots to ask us questions and so on. What can we understand about this? Perhaps a little bit more from a survey design considerations and survey practitioner perspective, a psychology perspective, a social science perspective, as it were. What is this telling us, and how is it helpful to us? And so I put this together, and you can tell me whether or not it's sort of helpful. But it's my attempt to sort of try to pick apart some of these big issues which we're all facing, and less about perhaps trying to give some solid answers. This is always my get out of jail card. I think I probably say this at the start of every time I do a talk. This is my way of sort of just excusing myself, perhaps. But it's just I do think a lot of the time it's less about having an answer and more about, look, have we got the right questions that we're asking here? And that's what I'm just trying to talk about. So I think I want to just to here's what I'm going to cover in the next sort of 30 minutes or so, and perhaps there's one element of just reminding ourselves that we sometimes think we've got this sort of real dichotomy. There's humans and there's machines, and never the twain shall meet. But perhaps it's not quite as stark as that, and perhaps that's a useful starting point for us to think about some of these sorts of things. And have we got are we with that in mind? Are we on a new era to replace human respondents? Even so, and then so talking about the whole issue and thinking through what we mean by synthetic respondents, and what's the data showing, what kind of respondents are LLMs or chatbots, machines, and then flipping this over. And I got one eye on Phil over there around sort of machines asking questions, and then let's sort of have a look and sort of just sum it all up and see where we get to. So just on this point about we've never been 100% human, really, and maybe we just need to sort of think about moving on from some of the artificial divides which we might have, because look, we've always, as humans, a part of us is always been tools. They extend us in ways that would otherwise not be possible. I mean, and just think of our use of clocks and the way in which they just shape the societies which we're in, shape our work practices, allow us to be organised around each other, and today the ubiquitous use of laptops, they're giving us capabilities which were unimaginable capabilities as humans, and maybe actually we live in a much more porous world of porous boundaries than we perhaps think of ourselves. These things aren't necessarily entirely separate from us. We don't necessarily have these kind of absolute divides between subjects and objects. Look at human implants. Does that make us machines? And it's kind of like these hybrid objects, as I think one person has put it. And arguably, digital is just the most recent form of this. But as I say here, look, the boundaries are even more blurred. And I like that distinction, which I picked up from somewhere, where saying, look, it's just we can think of a hammer as a tool, which does quite specific things, and computer games versus computer games, which are a bit more immersive events. And so you can see the way, perhaps, the trajectory of change, and perhaps the way in which these boundaries are becoming ever more blurred and ever more porous. And perhaps that really sort of sets the scene. But also, look, we've always looked to objects for answers, inanimate things to perhaps sort of give us answers. In ancient China, the I Ching is a stick game, I think, or not game, I shouldn't say that, but a bunch of sticks to provide guidance for decisions. So you toss the coins and sticks, and then you look up what those actually meant. Ouija boards, very, very popular in the sort of late 19th and early 20th century, trying to find answers to very human questions. Or I think the more familiar territory is that, and certainly from the psychology literature, Joseph Wiesenbaum with the ELIZA questions, with the computer sort of asking questions and responding in a fairly sort of basic way back in the 1960s. It's not as if there is anything wildly new about us looking for answers with assistance from the machines which we have, or the devices or the objects which we have available to us. So I guess the question here is that are we just at the latest version here of these many attempts to find answers from objects, or are we in this kind of fundamentally new territory? And I guess this is the sort of in some senses the big question, because implicit in that well, nobody really uses Ouija boards to find answers to stuff out anymore. Well, some people do clearly, but it's not widespread, I think it's fair to say. Where are we on that trajectory? So I think just useful just to think about that in terms of some of the backdrop as to where we are. And so that then sort of brings us here to the case in hand. And are we in a case for us to actually those failed experiments of the past? Actually, we're in a new and different place. Sorry. So sorry, inadvertently hit that slide for some reason. So, but perhaps the most important slide for some people. I think it's fair to say, from certainly my reading of the literature, and this is a very live field with lots of stuff coming out very rapidly, preprints appearing, and so on. So this moves around quite rapidly, and different people have different perspectives on it. So, but from my reading on this is that there's a lot of papers which are published which show pretty decent consistency between human and machine responses. Whether it's vote prediction, whether it's personality traits, areas, work for management studies, economics. There's quite a big literature which suggests that actually synthetic respondents can be used quite effectively to come up with responses which look very similar to data which has been collected from humans. So I think that's an important point to note before I start going into the buts. Okay, so the conversation, probably 80% of this presentation is the buts. But notwithstanding this really important point up front, I do think we need to be careful about publication bias here. There's if you don't find a relationship, probably not likely to publish it. So, that's the obvious kind of consideration which we need to be careful about here. But But so, but even if, let's say, even if we do find that, is that enough? Is it good enough? And because I worry that unless we've got a theoretical basis for the comparison, then, we don't know if we're looking in the right places. We don't know if we're making the right comparisons. We don't know, maybe it's just luck, and maybe it's just, as I say, it's just we're just buffeted around by what happens to get published, rather than having a proper sort of theoretical underpinning to how we understand this and what it should look like. And within the research industry, I think we're fairly practical on the whole, right? But and justifiably so, but sometimes we do need to do a bit of diving into thinking about what's the underlying mechanisms going on here that perhaps we need to understand if we're going to be able to properly evaluate these sorts of differences. So what happens when somebody answers a question? When we pose a question and someone answers it? And I think that's this is a subject where if you go back into the sort of I'm a slightly obsessive book buyer, and the sort of books I've got on survey design and the psychology of survey design, they're from the 90s probably, or the 80s. I don't think there's a lot which is, please redirect me if you think I'm wrong here, but I don't think there's this huge amount which is sort of very hot at the moment in this field, but I think we're not necessarily, we're so used to this sort of these tools, this machine, this way of operating, that we take for granted what goes on under the bonnet sometimes, and so we should. We don't have to be constantly looking back under it. Some of these conversations were had a long time ago, and we're pretty happy with where we got to. But it's when something new and different happens, is worth going back and getting that bonnet back open again and thinking about it. And I'd say that from my looking at this, I'd say there's a couple of ways which we can use psychology to help us understand what goes on when you're answering a question. Well, there's a couple of schools of thought. Okay, so one of which is the sort of more structuralist approach. So this is the notion that our minds are like computers. So I ask you a question, my brain starts whirring. I go to the relevant sort of vaults, that sort of where that information is held. I bring it back out, and there you go. And maybe sometimes that connection is a bit fuzzy, but essentially, that's what's happening. I have the information. You ask a question, I go and retrieve it. So the information is reasonably static. The question and that's a relatively straightforward structural way of thinking about it. The alternative approach is a more, what I think we can characterize as a constructivist approach, suggests that what we're always doing is on the fly, in a sense, pulling together different traces and actively sort of finding different traces which, once we're asked a question, and pulling them together and forming some meaning for which we then respond. So that suggests that it's a more dynamic process that's taking place, that we are more actively creating the response there in that moment. And so you can see there's quite a fundamental difference between those perspectives. And I think just how do we then sort of say, well, which one is working? Because in a sense, and this may be a little unfair, but in some senses, if we're then saying, well, actually, if we're going to have a synthetic respondent, then that seems to infer to me, at least, that we have a more structuralist sort of model is in operation, that if you got that, you could replace that. If you're doing more active meaning making, then maybe that's a little bit more tricky, perhaps. And so what's the evidence looking like? This is, to help us decide this. Well, look, you might say, well, look, a structured survey looks like people are responding in a computer-like way, and it's a bit like, you ask a question, online, shipped back to you after, however long it is, you get your answers, and that can, this stuff is hidden in a way that perhaps it wasn't previously. But it can seem quite computer-like, but just because it appears computer-like, it looks like it, doesn't mean that is necessarily the case. And what I would say is, look, if you go back to all of that sort of 90s survey literature, and it's still a conversation, I'd say that you can use that to say that actually we are more constructivist in the way in which we respond to surveys. So, these small differences in question wording, question ordering, that we all kind of have these big debates over and so on, and they can have a disproportionate impact on our responses. So I'd say that if you're really taking a structuralist approach, I'd say you're less likely to see that. I think that reflects the nature of you're taking more structuralist. It reflects the constructivist approach of more dynamic meaning making. So those sorts of little changes can influence the way, in quite subtle ways, the way in which you're then sort of pulling those bits together to create that sort of meaning on the fly. And there's just an example of something that was done by Ben Page, actually. It's a very Ben Page exercise. He was doing there's a sort of Yes Minister. You remember Yes Minister from some of you, and there was this question about, which I think has been used being used in many kind of forums in our industry of, we want to get a certain answer, or we want to sort of, they've got this survey answer, what do we do about it? And the advice from the civil servant was that, okay, we just have to ask the question in a slightly different way and we'll get a slightly different answer. And, and then Ben took it upon himself to replicate that, what that advice was, and found, yes, actually you do get a different answer. And so this is stuff which we all know about, and so I'd say that there's an argument here for that we actually do have this sort of more constructivist approach, which is possibly then harder to think about how does a machine replicate that. One other area I want to think about is metacognition, and this is sort of how we think, our response to how we feel and how we think. So it's our self-reflection when we're being asked a question. So we might find something sort of very easy to answer, this kind of felt fluency. And if we feel this felt fluency, and it's like, oh yeah, I remember that, yeah, I have a view on that one, then, that tells us something about what we think. It tells us something about how we feel about something. So, and here's the example, if you can easily recall a positive experience, maybe it's a slightly giving away my old sort of my old roots in mobile phone research, but of a battery lasting through a long day of use. Then if you ask that, and then you go and people can say, yeah, I remember, it's just like it was terrible, or it was great, and then you're self-reflecting a bit, it's telling you something on that one, and then when you get to the overall satisfaction, well, then that's you've collected information about yourself, about you've reflected upon your response, and so that kind of metacognition psychology, is part of how we go about responding to a survey. And I would argue we're not computational as computational as we think always when we're answering a survey. Sometimes we are, and I don't want to present this as some kind of binary, we're either one thing or the other. Sometimes we are, and for some questions perhaps we are, but for a lot of things maybe we aren't as much as we necessarily think. And so therefore, what I would say, look, if we want to get realistic answers from machines, we kind of need to think about how humans go about answering questions, because it's not necessarily as straightforward as we think, and we need to think about the psychology of what happens at that point. What is the psychology of that sort of question and answer process? Go on, John. Throw it at me.
Well, I love what you're saying, but I spend my life trying to do the opposite with human beings, trying to get realistic responses from them by removing those factors. And so the challenge is actually how to get human beings to answer truthfully by not being led by the way you ask the questionnaire.
But to some extent, it's inevitable. We're going to have, I don't think you can, we all have to frame questions in a particular ways. I think that the broad, just to sort of pull out to the sort of broad point, I think I'd say these are questions we should be asking about synthetic, in my mind. It's just like, well, okay, if we've got a bit more, that the way in which people are responding is a bit more kind of self-reflective, it's a bit more meaning-making in the moment, then that gives us perhaps a framework of thinking how to look at what's going on with a machine and when a machine might be useful, when it might be less useful. And I think that's all I'm saying. And what I'm trying to do is just to sort of start to throw into a little bit this sort of debate about, look, how are we evaluating this stuff other than in a purely empirical way? There's got to be some other means by which we do it, and this is a kind of starting point for that. It's not the whole answer by any means, but I think there's some, if we need to kind of go back and just think about the psychology of the survey, and in order to be able to think this through a little bit. Right.
Sorry, if I can just throw one
thing please.
As well. What is the truth? So for a respondent, we're eliciting responses, whether their answer is structuralist or constructive. We're trying to get a truth, and actually what we can really ever see is a facet or a reflection or a perspective of the truth. I think sometimes we get too caught up in almost the view that there's an absolute truth that we're trying to measure.
I think that's a really good point.
Maybe there isn't.
Yeah, maybe there isn't. But the one thing we do know we're trying to do is to replicate humans. So therefore, if we're trying to replicate humans, then with all their kind of foibles, then perhaps it's the way in which we reach a conclusion about what our answer is needs to be understood. If we're going to get to that point. So I think there's a sort of, I came across this area of machine psychology, which I'm sort of digging into a bit. I'm not sure if I fully understand it yet, but it's essentially sort of putting there, saying, okay, what's the psychology of the machine, as it were? I kind of quite like that, turning the tables a little bit, So what do we know about? So if we thought about that machine as a human, then what do we know about it from the literature? Well, one, it's kind of a bit sort of not all that representative, possibly, and I think this is a question mark for us. And again, look, I'm sure that there are solutions here which can address that, but again, this is a question which we just need to make sure, and I'm sure this has been part of your conversation between you having Phil sort of yesterday and this morning. But there's a great paper by Angela Wang and colleagues which is suggesting that LLMs can really struggle to represent marginalised groups. I don't think this is the challenge that AI has in this area generally is very well documented, but there's a sort of I think she has some useful ways of tangibly talking about this in terms of misportrayal. Doesn't effectively represent the perspective of different demographic groups, producing stereotypical responses and not reflecting diversity, or group flattening, it sort of homogenizes those diverse groups, resulting in a loss of nuance and erasure of subgroup heterogeneity. So I think, and she talks about the way, we got to this point because of the way in which sort of data is trained from data from the internet. Now, of course, that's not necessarily the way in which within our industry that would always be the case. But again, it's useful to consider that. Maybe there's a sort of, we're all familiar with stuff being made up. I thought this paper was quite nice, and that sometimes we're kind of we're all a bit hung up on humans in surveys succumbing to social desirability. Seems like LLMs do that as well, and also generating vanilla responses. Sometimes that can be the case. So again, it's not necessarily a panacea, but I think these things, there's a sort of broader point here that. And I overuse this sort of blog that Lorraine Daston did at the start of COVID. So this is I'm kind of appropriating this for an entirely different purpose, but I think it kind of lives on a bit. Is that she talked at that point about living in a period of radical uncertainty, thrown into a state of ground zero empiricism where we can't rely on the knowledge of the past to understand the present. And so if you're in these rapidly changing environments, then we're much more reliant on more chance observations, apparent correlations, and anecdotes, and you can argue with that a little bit. Of course, it's challengeable, but arguably, I would say that we're in an environment which is more changeable. It continues to be more changeable, and in relative terms, we're less predictable, we're less stable than we used to be. So what does that mean about the way in which we're therefore using machines which are trained on data from the past? So does that really are the dangers here about we're missing the first inklings of changes, little subgroups, little data points. Because actually, are we in danger of reflecting the consensus? Whereas actually, we need to look at the fringes, we need to look at the margins, we need to look at the sort of, the data which wouldn't necessarily sort of influence the average, as it were. And that's the sort of thing which is, perhaps, making this broader point is that humans are not infallible survey participants, to your points, John, but do we perhaps need to also exercise cautions when relying on machines as well? So, okay, so that's the sort of synthetic respondent bit. So what about actually asking questions? And I suppose that there's lots of things to start considering here again when we turn the tables and we're actually having machines ask questions of us rather than us asking questions of machines. And of course, we're in such an exciting zone period, aren't we, at the moment, where machines are so increasingly intimate for many people in their lives, and that I don't know if you've looked at Replica at all, but a hugely popular chatbot app, and millions and millions of users, 40% of whom create avatars to simulate a romantic relationship. And I think there was at one point where they tried to sort of get rid of that, but there was a sort of huge outcry, and then it was brought back in again. And but you name it: career coaching, financial advice, weight loss, fitness, many areas where it's really gaining in large numbers. And I would say that in here, I mean, there's obviously there's a whole discussion in itself, and throughout all of this, I think there's sort of great things and great possibilities, but also questions which we need to ask about it. And for me, this is one of the things, is that in any relationship, you kind of need to be asked questions, right? If no one ever asks you a question, that's the sort of complaint people might have about sort of, a friend or a parent or something. They never ask me a question about myself. They're just not interested, And so in a way, I'd say that implicit within all of this is the sort of is something about the asking of questions, and how do we explore that, and how do we think about it? And there's this super paper by a couple of psychologists called Kevin Courtill and Alex Gillespie, and they came across some work from the 1960s, and which they sort of started replicating this, and I'll talk about that work in a minute. But it was they have this sort of concept of the echo Borg, and the echo Borg was inspired by the Philip Dick's book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is then the basis for Blade Runner, the film Blade Runner, and one of the many thought experiments in the novel is about the role of belief in the way in which we attributed essence to machines, inner essence to machines. go back to the very beginning. You can see that's kind of what seems to happen a lot. But it's also, look, what role does a human body have in implying a human mind? And what happens if we play around with that a little bit? Because of course chatbots don't have human bodies. So is this a problem? So let me just tell you about this experiment. I just need to be careful that I sort of reflect this correctly. So they undertook an experiment, and there were two groups essentially within this experiment. One with a person who was basically saying the words from a chatbot with a sort of radio thing in their ear, and the second one with a text interface using the words from a chatbot. So like you might normally do. In both cases, people believed they were talking to a real person. Okay, so that was the subterfuge that was going on. So what were their experiences like? Well, those who experienced a text interface said, oh, so in both cases, this was a, they were communicating with as I say, they believed they were communicating with a real person, but the words were coming from a chatbot. Okay, just be really clear about it. So those who experienced a text interface said, my experience was artificial. It wasn't human. It was mechanical. It was computer-like. It was robotic. But those who encountered the echo Borg, where the human was speaking the words of the chatbot, voiced by a human, they would use human words to describe that then. So they'd be sort of shy, awkward, it's like slightly sort of not very smooth. So the point here, and it's worth having a read of the paper because it's quite an entertaining paper, it means that the nature of the interface can frame the interaction they found. So the question is, can that chatbot, how far can you go to really gain that human touch? Is the question which is raised by that. So that's one area, and the other area I think, and it slightly reflects the other conversation from earlier, is that how does a Q&A actually work? And so we looked at it from the other side. Well, when you're in a conversation, how do questions operate? How do they get to elicit an actual response? And psychologists looking at this, and there's again a really interesting paper, will say actually when someone answers you a question, you don't always have a ready answer. You're in a position where actually, you might not know, you might be unsure. And so it's pretty common for people to work together and say, oh, is it a bit more like this? Oh, maybe a bit more like that. And you kind of get into a conversation a little bit more. And there's, images or feelings or, things are put out there as a way of stimulating that memory. Now, to what extent are we, our chatbots sort of positioned to participate in that conversational remembering is maybe it is. And, I know, I've seen some of your stuff in action, Phil, and, maybe arguably it is, and so, but I think that's again, a question. It allows us this gives us some material, some kind of benchmark to say, well, let's use this in order to evaluate, if humans are operating in this way, then perhaps, we could be asking that of chatbots. And so, maybe we need to be and thinking about how can chatbots best reflect what humans do in that situation. And so therefore, as I say, there's lots of discussion about prompt engineering that we get to get stuff out of chatbots. Maybe we need to sort of think about the prompt engineering that chatbots use to get the best out of us, reflecting the psychology of that back and forth that happens. And so to make it as most effective as possible. So, look, I think the point here is that, as these machines become interviewers, then let's just understand what that dynamic is. If they don't, if people are feeling like that disembodied voice is mechanistic and computer-like, what should we do about that? How do we address it? If we've got the back and forth going on, then how do we then program that chatbot in a more effective way to have a more realistic conversation? Can you actually do it? What are the limitations of it? So these are the kind of questions I think that we need. We need to, we need to understand what happens in that dynamic when humans are involved. And so just to sort of sum it up as effectively as possible, is that you may read what I've said there as sort of as sounding a little bit as if it's sort of, as I said at the outset, as if I'm questioning it, and those questions lead to negative conclusions. Not necessarily. I'm just saying that these are questions which we need to, which are hopefully helpful to us, to be able to evaluate, and if things aren't working as well as they should, then find better ways to do it, because we need to. It's not a matter of just sort of throwing rocks at something. It's us sort of just thinking this through in an effective way. Knowing the limitations of something is as valuable as knowing the strengths. In my book, and I grew up in a household where we did. My dad was an engineer. We everything. You had a toolbox. You had a tool for everything. One thing I learned: you don't use a hammer to put a screw in the wall. You use a screwdriver. That's a limitation of the hammer. But that's good to know. And so that's the sort of the same principle applies here. I would argue. And an important consideration as well is like what do humans do? That act, the act of asking a question, I think it's worth us sort of having that conversation about, have we understood that well enough? Has the sort of conversation about that got a little bit lost in some of the books in the 90s, and we can bring that a little bit more to the fore, because it's kind of useful right now to bring that back. Now that things are sort of, we need to be looking under the bonnet again. So I'd say that that's it, both for the case for the synthetic respondents and for machines asking questions. But also, maybe as a sort of closing point is that, are we comfortable with the ethics of not asking people questions, and what reputational risks may arise as a result of that? But that's a whole nother paper, so I will leave that for another time. But if you want more, there's some links to stuff there, and Out of Time is a place where quite a lot of this stuff is pontificated at great length. But if you want something a bit more pithy, and you want access to those papers, have a look on the blog, this blog Frontline B-Side, Conversations with Code, and the other thing about, there's an article there about chatbots with that lovely tree picture there. Those will have access to some of this presentation and the papers and so on. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colin. Questions, comments, Phil?
I knew it.
Well, it's probably more an observation than a question, but you might have kind of thoughts to build on what I say. But I agree absolutely, particularly in the latter part of your paper, which is sort of the area I'm more involved in now, about chatbots that we do have to think, what would a human do? And I think it's helpful to draw an analogy with what a moderator would do. A moderator would know that when they're talking to an engineer in their 50s versus a teenager, that they'd adopt a different tone and frame questions differently, they'd use different language. Chatbot won't instinctively know to do that unless you train it to do that. So the human needs to be in the loop to train it. So I think it's important we always have that human in the loop, firstly. And secondly, I suppose I think, and I would say this because it's what I do, but I think chatbots really are an enabler of deeper insight for market research. But if I have one concern, it's that I'm seeing a lot of solutions emerge that come more from the technology space. And technologists don't necessarily know how market research needs to work. So I think it's also important that the human in the loop is sort of not just asking questions as a human would, but asking them as a market researcher would. So not having leading questions, not asking inappropriate questions, those types of things. So that type of training is very necessary as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're on the same page. Yeah. Thank you.
Since I'm sitting here, I kind of to build on that. I'm sort of curious: is your ongoing assumption that the human-to-human response is the truer response?
I mean, I'm going to go back to Corin's point here, is that it's hard to pin down what is the true response. But I suppose it's fair to say that implicit in what I've just gone through, then I suppose I am fundamentally saying that, yes. And I think that's the, but I can see where you're going, and I think that's a reasonable challenge in that maybe you get a truer response from people talking to a machine, perhaps, yeah. So if that is where you're going.
I don't know that I believe that, but
here.
it's a question that
Yeah.
is worth exploring.
Yeah, no, I
We
agree.
now have,
I
and it's
agree.
not to say all the things we've all been doing for all our careers are wrong.
Yeah.
It's, we have new technology and new access, and maybe we will find out things we never could know before.
I think that's a good challenge and build, and I'd say that I think that sort of goes into this sort of domain of what happens when people when you ask the question and you give an answer, and what are the mechanisms involved. And I agree that there are certain points at which, particularly around social desirability, there's certain sensitive areas, people having some anonymity involved, baked in, and there's lots of guidance around that, then maybe around that, then it maybe you get a better response to a machine which can offer more anonymous in a more, well, arguably possibly a more anonymous environment, possibly not. But yeah, I think an interesting point to consider. Yeah.
Sorry to hog the microphone there, but we have seen some evidence of that actually, that for more sensitive topics, that a question posed by a chatbot actually can elicit more information than a question written by a researcher. So that's not necessarily human to human in the sense that the person's asking the question, but the question's been written by a human, which I don't think is really due to the nature of the question itself, but it is to the anonymity point.
Yeah.
That people maybe feel, or some people maybe feel more open and able to express themselves
Yeah.
when they feel it's completely anonymous.
Yeah, one comment from my side on thought that we put too much pressure on or hopes on the LLMs. They are just language models. We cannot expect that they produce everything we are as a human. I would say a language model is at best kind of can mimic the associations our neocortex has, but the human is a coherent behavior of all our other brain components, all our bodies and so forth. So there's so much more on how we are humans work that we cannot expect that an LLM can well simulate us. You can see that an example of driving. Yeah? For us, it takes a few weeks, and we drive everywhere in the world. So with the autonomous cars, they use this kind of deep learning technologies, and they have billions of more data, yeah? But still cannot drive autonomous. So the way this AI is trained is fundamentally different. We are trained as human. So there will be a new technology needed to really simulate the human. So, and with this in mind, I think we can be more humble in expecting what the LLMs can really do to simulate true human response.
I think a really interesting point is that sort of embodied knowledge in a way, isn't it? That you kind of learn experientially, how to hold a tennis racket when you serve and so on. You can only really learn that when you through actually doing it. And I think sometimes we seek to ask questions in a kind of quite stripped down way, which sort of ignores some of those sorts of things and overemphasize the cognitive. The only thing I would say is that within our industry, clearly we ask questions and we get answers, as it were, unless you're doing some ethnography on the tennis court or something, but on the whole, it is sort of slightly, it's done in that particular environment, and so I guess we were asking more about a particular type of knowledge and understanding than others. But I take it. I'm with you. I think it's an interesting point, and And you know, in some ways, I see that you could argue there's quite a lot of discussion about the way in which a lot of the knowledge we have is held between us rather than held within us individually. And so I think for me, that in some senses the even more exciting bit about this is trying to understand that kind of collective knowledge which we might have. You know, so actually, you know, we've been focusing on individuals. Well, actually, maybe, you know, we have a way here that we can actually get something which is a bit more collective, and so we don't have to, simply because our unit of data collection is the individual, then the unit of analysis and explanation is the individual. What about if we actually could detach that, and our analysis could be about more collective aspects of understanding? You know, just building on your point, as it were. So I think there's some really interesting and exciting themes around that where we could go with this. So, but thank you. I thought that's interesting. I think a question down here as well. So just.
I'm curious to hear more about your perspective on representation in all of this, because there is a question, and sort of building on the point you were just making about moving from the individual to the collective. There's something in there about how we're training these new tools for analysis based on how we're defining the collective, sort of as defined by the inputs to the training.
Yes.
What do you see as some of the bigger challenges there, or alternatively thinking about it through a positive lens, where have you seen opportunities to do better or novel solutions that can address some of these things?
Well, I think so I guess there's sort of two aspects to this, aren't there? Well, there's many aspects, but two things that come to my mind is that in some senses you could argue there's if you get it right, there are clearly hard to reach groups in our population. So if we look at the antithesis of sort of marginalised groups, but perhaps underrepresented groups, young males, are hard to get hold of and expensive to get hold of, or senior business decision makers, or whatever it may be. And so obviously, sort of, just a particular aspect of representation I'm talking about here. Then there's going to be a kind of like challenge here about, well, surely there's an opportunity to better represent, and if we've got the appropriate, if we can then think about, well, what's the data which we're training on, we're not necessarily so, and this is where people like John will be able to sort of say, look, there's lots of different ways in which we can train. We're not necessarily just scraping the internet. We can feed in other data and so on. And if we can do that, then happy days in some, perhaps, but there are obviously still going to be limitations with that. And so we can have better quality representation. I think where you've got more marginalised groups, then I would want to hear from people better equipped than me to talk about that. But some of the concerns and the work of people like Angela Wang in that great paper, which I definitely recommend, suggests that certainly if you're relying on the internet to provide you with the data on which to train this, then it's really problematic. And I'd want to understand how technologists were exploring this and developing things in order to address exactly those sorts of points, because right now it seems like there's some very serious questions to answer. So, but I'm not a technologist here, but I do, that's my question as much as it is yours. I'd like to sort of understand how best to do that. But so I've kind of half answered your question with also slightly looking over at John here. So, is that fair? Did you have a?
No, I think it's interesting, and everything that has sort of been talked about over the past couple of days, representation is sort of the unspoken about or briefly touched on thing that sits alongside a lot of this.
Yeah.
And even in thinking about how you ask the question specifically through the lens of political polling, there have been specific moments in time in recent history, and we've got a moment in time or a couple of moments in time coming up that give cause for pause around. You can ask the polling question any sort of way, but if someone's not answering, you go to bed thinking one thing and wake up the next morning surprised before your shower with the news that Donald Trump is your president.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah. So yeah, but I think, so I put that question front and centre of how do we address that. So I think that's, I'm with you. I'm being the questioner rather, and sort of like representing the work that's been done by people like Wang and others to say, hey, based on what they've seen, we have a problem, and this is the nature of the problem, and I think this is the thing that we need to be challenging technologists with in their solutions to say, what are you doing about this, and how does that work? And
we're going to have to draw it to a close, but maybe we can touch on representativity at the on the panel at the end as well. Please join me in thanking Colin for his presentation.